try their hands in something like a Fiscal Responsibility Act. Because politicians would normally want to spend, right, if they want to influence voters. But you get Fiscal Responsibility Act, and how do we explain this? And I would argue that it's got something to do with inequality. If you actually look at fiscal deficit in India, India runs the largest fiscal deficit worldwide. We talk of Greece and we talk of Italy, and I know in CESP there are debates about that it doesn't matter. So I don't belong to that school of thought, because if you look at it intertemporally, deficits do matter. I don't want to get into that debate currently. So the issue is, this has been there for long. In the beginning of the 90s as well, India was amongst the top 3 countries, including Turkey and Argentina. And we know all about the reform process as to why the deficits may have grown, because as you try to liberalize, you cut customs revenues. Okay? So basically one source of revenue went. You know that in 96, 97 you had the pay commissions, which actually resulted in expenditure increases. And there are many other reasons. You actually tried to liberalize the financial sector, so government started to borrow increasingly at market rates of interest rather than at financially repressed rates. So therefore interest payments also rose. So fiscal deficits rose for a variety of reasons that I won't be going into. But in 1991, there was a fiscal correction, of course imposed by the IMF, which by 94 the government got fed up of that and actually paid back the loans in advance so that it had the fiscal space to run more fiscal deficit. You can see after 94, it tried to maintain the fiscal deficit, but actually they increased. And then finally by about 2002, 2003, there was again a pressure to rein those in, and the Fiscal Responsibility Act came into. Okay. Now, at the same time, there is another macroeconomic event that was taking place, which is that after the 90s, there was a huge decline in public investment. And the first person to talk about this seriously was a political scientist, Atul Kohli. And he, in his book on state-directed development, looking at India, argues that this is actually a key element of India's economic growth story that has got missed out. That people have not really talked about this. Because why is it that a state which claims to be growth-promoting state leaves out public investment, when we know that in India, public investment actually crowds in, private investment, and therefore is growth-promoting. So if you look at the public investment data, then you can see it sort of grows till about 98, 86, 87, and then there's a secular sort of a decline, which sort of bears out what I'm saying. Just to show you a quick regression, you can see that, this is private investment, and you can see public investment and lagged public investment has a huge impact on private investment and therefore on growth. ERD is a post-reform dummy. CP is the cost of credit. So you actually have some accelerator effects. Public investment does crowd in private investment, and therefore growth promoting. And so Kohli puts this as an issue to be debated. So why is it that a state that is promoting growth would actually reduce public investment? Now, the standard explanation for this is that if you are actually a state which is going to come up with a hard budget constraint, so with liberalization you were forced to reduce the deficit, then politicians who are basically myopic would like to reduce public investment because that has large gestation periods. It might reflect in votes not for you but for your successor government, and so it's easier to cut public investment than to cut consumption or transfer expenditures by the state. And so as a result, just this myopia on the part of governments, plus the fact that there is sort of a different discount rate for investments over consumption, that's what leads to politicians favoring an expenditure compression through a decline in public investment. Now the story that we tell is somewhat different as to why you may have something like this. So think of it in the following way, that public investment does improve the productivity of everyone. And if you can think of people as, being endowed along, let's say, a straight line. So people are basically, some people have low endowments, some have high endowments. Public investment affects everyone's endowments positively. So the public investment could be on roads or on education, and everyone gets affected. However, those who have more complementary private endowments benefit more. So everyone benefits, but some benefit more than others do. Okay. And if that is true, then you would actually have the possibility that people who benefit more would actually like to influence the government that this public investment actually does take place. So that is a political economy story that I'm not going to be talking of here as subject of another paper. But what happens as a result is that there is a disproportionate benefit that happens to people who have larger factor endowments. And therefore there is a rise in inequality. And therefore endogenously, once there is a rise in inequality and the government which is in power sort of realizes this, then it would actually, looking at a median voter, transfer its attention to people who have been adversely affected by this. And as a result, the government would change its attention towards redistributive expenditure rather than public investment. And so endogenously in this model, one is trying to explain why is it that public investment, which is the goose that lays the golden egg, actually subverts itself in the process. It does good things, but it also engenders inequality. To actually offset the inequality, the government is forced to turn its attention towards redistribution. And so that's why you get some of the outcomes that we're actually being looking at. Now the small version of this setup that I will just present very fast to you given the shortage of time is when the government actually borrows, okay, for this to happen. And so the borrowings can actually be deployed in two ways. It can be deployed either for public investment or for redistributive transfer. Think of it as when the government actually borrows, there is a model which is there in the market, which is that priority, you don't know what it's going to do with those borrowings. If it spends on redistributive transfers, large numbers of people who are not as well endowed benefit, but it does not have that much of a kick to the growth rate as when it spends on public investment. And so the impacts that are there when borrowings can be for either of these two categories of expenditure would be quite different. Before I get down to the model, just a pointer as to time frames in this. So it's well known from the growth literature at least, okay, that 1980s is more sort of a turning point than 1991. And this was again pointed out by Kohli when he sort of argues that actually the redistributive thing sort of went and the liberalization phase started even by Indira Gandhi. And so and also the people who work in the area of inequality know that after the 1990s, inequalities have increased significantly. Deaton and Dredd sort of talked about this earlier, but faculty at CESP have been talking about this a lot. So you can see that in various ways. I'm not going to go into this. You can actually see that the top decile share of income consumption expenditure has actually gone up. There is a bottom decile, which is the blue line out there, is almost flat. If you take actually below 50%, which is the green line, it's not rising as much as that. It's going to show that inequalities are rising. So the two questions that we're really looking at initially are, when government expenditures are financed by borrowing, does an increase in inequality result in a change in the composition of expenditure? And does that inequality result in voter preferences changing in order to limit the borrowing capacities of government? So it's a standard setup. I'm just going to show you the two-period setup of this. So there is an agent with consumption across 2 periods. You start out with an endowment Y1, and you can receive a lump sum redistributive R. So your income is basically Y1 plus R. And from that, you take away how much you're going to actually invest, which is K1. That is the consumption possibility in the first time period. Production is basically complementary. Your savings or investment is complementary with public investment. So here's the idea that public investment is crowding in private investment and therefore growth. So do this in a very simple framework. I'm really borrowing an idea here which is very much there in Obstfeld and Rogoff. It's a very standard production function that they use a lot. And government may borrow So the T is the level of debt, and you can spend it on R, which is redistribution, or you can actually spend it on public capital expenditures. These are the two. Problem is, governments can actually repay. In this case, you repay 1 plus R times R being the interest rate, or you might default, in which case there is, this is because of maybe the institutions that are there with respect to bankruptcy, or there are various reasons you can give for it, that creditors will only get a fraction of the income that is possible. So as I said, the government is free to basically do what it wants with the borrowing, and it could spend it on public capital formation or on redistribution. So we then show that, as a result of this, that you can actually prove that if you look at what is what happens in case the government does not repay, or in the case where it pays, you can say that actually the level of redistributive transfers that governments would like to do, or the representative individuals in society would like to happen, would be higher when the government does not repay, than when it does, when there is repayment. And there is a very simple intuition for this sort of result. That is that when the government is not going to repay, then actually, there is question of you're going to lose a large fraction of your output, because that is what creditors will actually get. And therefore, if that's going to happen, you may as well in the first time period itself, looking forward, try to offset that by trying to get as large an amount of a transfer, so as to reduce the second period tax that would actually be there. So the question we then ask is, what creditors looking at a situation in which governments might spend on redistribution versus public investment, what would creditors in a financial market do? And without taking you through the various steps of the proof, the logic is quite simple. So here is the creditor who is basically passing on his savings to the government, and effectively the government might do two things. One is it might redistribute, second is it might spend on public investment. If it redistributes, it reduces the growth rate going forward. If it spends on public investment, it increases the growth rate going forward. Now, a rational forward-looking creditor would therefore argue that, the more, when inequality rises, since as inequality rises, the government would actually want to focus more on redistribution, and that reduces future growth and therefore future repayment possibilities of the government, then it's better that as inequality rises, that I reduce the ability of the government to raise resources and therefore redistribute. And that's the result that we really prove, that the rise of inequality, which as I said was engendered by the boost, which was the public investment, which is focusing the government's attention more towards redistribution. So higher growth in our story, which is actually inequality creating, focuses the government on redistribution. The government which is borrowing to do that is actually being forced by its creditors to borrow less in order that that does not take place. That's really the story that is happening, and I basically proved that result. I'm not going to take you through that because of lack of time. Okay. Second quick thing that I want to point out too is, in the story I've been pointing out to up to now, is that inequality is really a constraint on what governments can do. What is inequality reduction is an objective of government? Okay, so that's the second question that we're really asking. And this we're asking this question in a more standard macro framework. In the standard macro that is done, looking at policy, especially monetary policy, you know that there is a standard demand curve with an output gap. There is a standard Phillips curve, which is a supply side story. And the standard thing has a loss function with a monetary authority or a Taylor rule. And the question here is that this ignores two things. Okay? One is it ignores the fiscal authority, which we know is important in a developing and emerging market context. And also it assumes the monetary authority is independent of the fiscal authority. And these are issues which we are grappling with currently in policy making. Because if you look at the recent debates between the finance minister and the Reserve Bank, you actually found the previous finance minister saying that, he was almost sort of saying that the Reserve Bank is going to change policy. Okay? There's no two ways about that. And when the Reserve Bank governor did not fall in line, okay, he made some very unhappy statements. Okay? But fortunately, got pushed up to becoming the president. You can see this. Fine, okay, I'll finish. You can see this with the current finance minister. In fact, he called a press meeting just the day before monetary policy announcement. And he basically said that the Reserve Bank should actually walk in the same direction as we do. And when the Reserve Bank did not do that, then he basically, he tried his best to influence. I know that because, working with the Reserve Bank on its monetary policy committee, I see all the influences that happen. When it did not happen, then as a result, he sort of, said that, okay, they're supposed to walk alone, then we walk alone, that's about it. And you can see that even the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission basically says, we expect RBI to support growth, and growth should take precedence over inflation. Okay? So that's the standard loss function that we deal with in monetary theory, right? Between output gaps and inflation gaps. And you're basically saying that the monetary authority is trying to minimize the loss function with respect to the standard other parts of the story on demand and supply that I showed you. But supposing inequality aversion is a part of the objective of the fiscal authority, which it is. Part of the reason the deficits are in place is because of high subsidies. So basically you're trying to reduce inequality. That's one of the stories. So supposing there are two types of agents, there are rich and poor agents, and we want to do redistribution. And there is a fiscal authority which is looking at redistribution, but also wants to stimulate the growth of the economy. Okay? So like I said earlier, it's redistribution or public investment type stimulation. And there is a monetary authority which is basically dealing with interest rate policy or money supply policy. We take a standard macro framework. This is the supply side Phillips curve story. Okay, so inflation is expressed, Y is the output gap, and there is there are random shocks which are represented by U. Take the standard demand side story. Okay, so these are well known. These are things which are proved in McCallum's famous book on monetary theory. You can prove this from micro foundations. Okay, I'm not going to go through that. So basically, G is government fiscal expenditure, M is the monetary policy, pi is the inflation rate, and epsilon is the shock. So that's basically the demand side. Think of two types of agents, they're rich and poor. Okay? On a fraction, B are rich, so their income is By, and 1 minus By is poor. These guys pay a tax, those guys, let's say, receive a transfer. Okay? And there's post-tax income. And for simplicity, these are the guys who are going to buy the government bonds, which actually represent the deficits of the economy. Okay. And so the government budget is basically on expenditures and transfers, and there are bond purchases and tax revenues. Okay. So what we're adding in, the third equation, is the government budget constraint. Okay. So there's a government budget constraint along with the standard IS shocks and standard supply side shocks. You can find out the time paths of inflation, output, and transfers. And now look at the government's loss function. So what we're bringing in new to the literature is basically that there is a fiscal authority with a loss function. So it has a loss over inflation from its target, which is phi hat, and YT is the output gap. And now theta Y is the actual share of high income people's income in society. By, and theta is what the government would want to bring it down to. So that's basically the objective of government. And tau is the transfer that it's actually able to do. So that's the redistribution gap. Okay? And it gives a weight to all this. You have a standard central bank loss function, okay, over output and inflation. And you can actually, you can solve this in a very simple framework. Okay? So everyone forms expectations of what's going to happen going forward. Shocks are realized. Fiscal authority seeing the shock does fiscal policy, monetary authority does monetary policy, okay? And you can solve that, so you get reaction functions, you can find out the Nash equilibrium, these are the values, and then you can basically find out the expected values and find out the levels. So the interesting thing is to look at the transfers, okay? And you can actually see that the level of transfers depends very seriously on these lambda 1 terms, which is basically the weight that is given to output growth by the fiscal authority and the monetary authority. You can see there's a tension that's taking place over here. If their two weights are different, the transfers in the economy get affected very seriously. But now think of it a little more carefully. remember that in institutional terms, the fiscal authority chooses the central bank governor, right? So instead of solving it in this way, what we would prefer to do it is as a two-stage game, where you select a governor who has a weight over output, knowing what will happen in the second period. So you basically work backwards. And when you do that, so basically you first select the governor and the weight that he might place on this. Okay. And then you basically work out in your loss function what's going to happen. And you get that it is optimal for you over a long period of time to select a governor who gives lesser weight to output than you actually do. So there is a tension between the short run and the long run. In the short run, you would want the RBI to actually focus more on output, give less weight to inflation. But if you were thinking long run, you would want it to be exactly the opposite. And the simple intuition for that is that basically the more conservative is the central bank, the more it targets inflation, the less is going to be the impact on aggregate demand. And so supposing the central bank did not target inflation, then actually you're going to have a situation in which aggregate demand is actually going to get reduced. And when that gets reduced, the fiscal authority faces the problem that it has less tax revenues, and it actually has to therefore make more redistributive expenditures given that the demand has fallen in the economy. And that is the source of tension that is taking place between the two authorities. So let me just wrap up by saying that when fiscal authorities are bothered about redistribution, and that is part of their setup, and they interact with monetary policy authorities, there could be a tension about what is the type of policy you want to do in the short term, vis-a-vis what you want to do in the long term. And that may be the tension that we are actually witnessing today between